Welcome to the latest episode of our Industry Insights series podcast, where we feature inspirational women in the consulting industry. In this episode, we will unravel the process to problem solving with professional tips and tricks advised by yourself, the director of Forensic and Litigation Consulting team at FTI Consulting. So Joanna, thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this podcast. Before we start our interview, would you like to introduce a little bit about yourself and your role at FTI Consulting?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here to, share my knowledge and, tell you more about, consulting world and why I love being a consultant here at FTI. I'm one of the directors here in the FLC department, so the Forensic Litigation and Consulting department at FTI. We're a global firm and we are actually listed on the US stock exchange, which makes us slightly different in the structure of our business. We are a global risk consultancy, so my main role is to help clients mainly to address their financial or accounting issues. So that could range from investigating employee misconduct to calculating these payroll compliance and wage underpayments, to even just help calculating a dispute claim. How much should a particular party get rewarded in a commercial dispute in a court case. So our cases are in the news and it's always interesting to see it, so that makes our job always interesting and very different all the time.
Wow, that is absolutely so awesome. And it's really interesting hearing about your side of the role, because generally we always hear about management consulting, etc. But this is absolutely very, very interesting for our audience as well. So thank you for that introduction, Joanna. In this episode, we also want to narrow down on the process of, for example, project delivery and frameworks to develop solution. So we'll now proceed to the very first question of the interview. What is the process like for you from the time you receive a project from the client to when you deliver the solution to them?
That's very different because every single project is so different. That's what keeps our job always interesting. Our clients range from, lawyers and litigation firms to, CFO of global corporations. So every project and every request that the client have or the issue that the client has is always different. The process usually starts with an email or a briefing call from the client, telling us a bit about the background of, the issue, as well as, kind of the problem that they're facing. And it's about trying to actively listen to, okay, the client has this issue, what can we do? And so the next phase is usually, depending on the resources that we have or the amount of information we know, just a bit of brainstorming, thinking in terms of what we would need as a team, what would be the size of the team, what kind of things do we need from the client? How could we structure the project? Would it be a phased approach to get more further information? And this kind of brainstorming helps us to formalize the engagement and put in that kind of engagement letter, which every project needs, to sign off to make sure that our scope is limited to a certain issue. The fees are all agreed, and the time frame is always agreed. So that is always a very important part of any project. So once we have that kind of signed engagement letter, the project can kick off. And so we usually start with a kickoff call with the client and also the internal team, just to make sure everyone's aligned with what we're going to do in terms of the approach, the timeframes, any issues that we might face, in terms of pushback from the client of certain things, or, information that we think we might not get. And, just having that early discussion just helps, with project planning so much easier, and making sure that the project runs smoothly. And then we always also go through, some initial document requests or document and data requests, and making sure the client understands what we need and addressing those initial kind of questions that they might have. So once we kind of go through that initial planning phase, that's kind of when the juicy part of the investigation of our work happens. It's very different on every single project, depending on the complexity. It could be a 1 month, very quick turnaround project to a 2 to 6 month project. And so that's when, that depends on, the type of analysis that we will need to do. That could be, simple document review, just reviewing certain financials of the company and, making certain findings based on their financials. It could be interviews, it could be interviewing the CFO or the sales manager about certain practices and, confirming whether their practices are in alignment with company policy, or, does it actually indicate that they're actually doing something improper. And then what we're doing a lot more now these days is a lot of data analytics, because, you know, every firm has just so much data. And so, you know, being able to extract that kind of financial as well as, you know, expense data or timesheet data, and, you know, running queries and analyzing it to, you know, put out results. That's a really large part of kind of how we do our work these days as well. And so, you know, these are just some types of ways that we do our investigation. Sometimes during the process, you realize, hey, I actually don't have the expertise in this area. We need to grab, you know, more people in the team. And that's when we, you know, that's the benefit of working in such a large consultancy company like FTI. You know, we have experts in, you know, retail, we have experts in mining, you know, in you know, data privacy, and, you know, we'll give them a call, say, hey, you know, we have this issue with this client, you know, how can you help us? And, you know, everyone's always really happy to jump on. And then, so yeah, it's just working, you know, with both a team of, you know, usually some seniors, some juniors, and a partner, and we kind of go through all the kind of information that we need to kind of get to a result and to address the client's issue. The final output is usually some type of report, where we will document, you know, what steps we took, and then, you know, the assumptions we make, because sometimes we need to make certain assumptions, and then the findings of, you know, yes, there was a fraud, or yes, you know, or maybe no, there wasn't any fraud, and it's just a, you know, maybe a management behavior issue, or in certain cases, for example, that wage underpayment, it'd be the value of the wage underpayment is this. So having that would probably be the final output. Sometimes, as I said, it's a 1 month turnaround, very quick reporting, but other times it's a much more complicated back and forth with the client to get more data, to get further clarification. And, you know, it is a back and forth, and having that client relationship that, you know, makes a project successful.
Oh, wow. That sounds very hands-on. Like, just by sitting here, I'm already like, oh, whatever junior or whatever person going into this project, they'll be having so much fun with the amount of things that they're learning. Oh my goodness, that's fantastic to hear. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer, Joanna. And you also listed out some of the important tools and skills that we also need when delivering projects as well. So that was a very, very insightful response. Now on to the next question. What are the frameworks you use to break down and solve these problems?
Framework, that's a really funny question. It made me really think about it, because like when we address clients' problems, you know, our main framework is just trying to understand, okay, you know, actively listen to the client, and what do they actually want to achieve, what is their goal, and what is their problem, and that is all about, you know, once you kind of understand, you know, what their issue and their problem is, then we kind of then break it down in that way. So once we understand their problem, you know, we usually go, okay, what kind of information do we need? What data and documents and people do we need to talk to, you know, figure out how to address that problem? And then we break it down to, okay, these are the action steps that we will need to do to kind of address almost each of the issue. And so, for example, you know, in our payroll compliance, you know, the issue is, you know, okay, you know, an employer might have underpaid staff, like, you know, you at, you know, Woolworths or something. I shouldn't have said names, but you know, you're doing a job, and maybe an employer has, you know, underpaid staff, and that could be just because of, you know, using the incorrect overtime penalties, or using incorrect pay rates, and then what kind of, so then if that's the issue, then what kind of information would we need to, you know, identify, you know, those kind of problems, or to solve that kind of problem? So, you know, the documents we would need is, you know, what is the enterprise agreement that they are working on? What is, you know, the timesheet data, or how much did they get paid in the payslip data? You know, how long has that employee been working there? So it's kind of understanding what data there is and documents there is. And then, you know, then we would break it down to, okay, what is the criteria? What are we trying to address here to help solve the problem? So, you know, in the terms of the payroll compliance, it would be, you know, okay, you know, we know the enterprise agreement. So what we would do is, you know, map out, okay, the criteria is, you know, if they reach 76 hours in a fortnight, they should get paid overtime. If they're a casual, they should get this penalty loading, you know, and mapping out a criteria and then applying it against the timesheet. So having a kind of criteria to apply kind of the issues and the data. applying the data to the criteria allows us to kind of break down the problem. On another kind of side of, things like investigations where you kind of really don't know where to even start, sometimes a client might get a, whistleblower claim, of an employee, having misconduct in some sort of way. So how do we start? Where do we even start when we get these kind of letters? And so, most of the time the employer doesn't even know, is this actually claiming a legitimate claim or is it just a disgruntled employee? So they're at the stage of, they don't really want to flag, they don't want to raise too much attention in those circumstances. And so knowing all this kind of information, again, we go back to what kind of data or documents and people, would we need to help address kind of the issues that the client is facing. And so, going back to if the whistleblower claim has, various issues that maybe they're saying the employees, is, falsifying employee expenses or, signing off checks on behalf, forging the boss's signature on checks or something like that. So for every allegation, we would look at, okay, what data and documents would be available. So maybe for the employee expenses, inflating employee expenses, we would look at how are employee expenses lodged? Is it just a formal, is it a paper form? Sometimes there's still people using paper forms and being signed, or do you guys actually have a electronic system where people submit their expenses and everything, all the receipts are saved in a system? And so understanding, what is available to investigate that issue. And then we would develop an action plan against each of the each of the issues. So maybe for the employee expenses, we would create, use our fraud analytics and create kind of various fraud tests to identify certain issues that we think would identify these kind of high risk transactions that would be indicative of that employee inflating that expense. So for example, we would be running has an employee expense being duplicated, in the same date for the same amount, or maybe the value is just rounded values, very generic $2,000, $1,000, or maybe an expense is on a weekend or a day that the employee is supposed to be on leave. And so kind of understanding what the issue is in the data, then we can kind of create little criterias or different breaking down different steps and action plans what we would do to address what the client wants to identify in the end and help them decide, okay, is there an issue here or is there not an issue? What can be done next to make sure that the issue is addressed, or even just things like, are there control failures that they need to address? So that's kind of the framework. It's nothing really fancy, but it always goes back to, what is the client, interested, what is the client's problem in that way.
Wow, it sounds like as a consultant, we really need to be very resourceful and then also very adaptable just in case if we come across a problem that might not necessarily have a particular framework. We need to be able to adapt to that and see what resources there are and just utilize it. Oh, thank you so much for that answer, Joanna.
Yeah, you're totally right there. That's that's the fun part of being in consulting, and also the frustrating part of being in consulting. Sometimes it is outside your, really challenging you to think outside the box in that way, and trying to think, okay, how can I use what I know or use what I have to figure out a solution for the client.
Wow. They always say consulting is just new, refreshing, challenging. Every day is a new day. That you just summarized it all there. And that kind of leads us to the next question as well. What do you think are the most important soft and hard skills when solving these client-based problems?
Well, let's just start, I guess, with hard skills, because I think there are a lot of soft skills. Hard skills, you need to know your stuff. So you need to be technically sound in, I guess, your area. So, for example, for us, having accounting knowledge, whether it's through CA or CPA, having that kind of accounting base, just allows you to really understand what you're looking at. What is a debit, what is a credit, what is that in terms of a financial account and business system. We also, you know, a lot of our colleagues also, you know, do further valuation work there, get a lot of valuation experience, and also try and understand the, you know, legal frameworks on, you know, when and, you know, how can an expert report be submitted, and, you know, or that, you know, legal court system a little bit. That helps definitely in our frame of work. Apart from, you know, being technically sound, soft skills, as I mentioned, so important in consulting. You know, being able to be detailed orientated. We always say that if it's not written down, you haven't actually done the work. So, you know, making sure your working papers are very well documented, such that, you know, anyone who comes into your working paper, you know, can immediately understand what has been done and reach to the same conclusion that you kind of reached. And that is so important, because sometimes, you know, your project might finish, or the first part of your project finishes in a year, and then maybe a year later you get a call back from the lawyer and, you know, asking you questions about something you might have done a year ago. And if your working paper isn't at that standard, it's sometimes very difficult to try and recall what happened, or maybe that staff might have left. So, you know, having you know, being detailed oriented is very important in the consulting. Another really good skill that is essential is just communicating and building relationships, not just with the client, and, you know, making sure that the client is up to date with, you know, the status of the project, and making sure that they feel like they're involved, you know, when we find issues, or to make sure that we address their kind of concerns, but also internally, because, you know, whenever working as a one-person team, it's always a team project where you're working with people in Australia, sometimes internationally, and is making sure, you know, people are aligned on, you know, what the deadlines are. And sometimes it's also about the difficult communications of, you know, hey, you know, we need to really push on, and, you know, maybe sometimes do a bit of overtime, or, you know, what is the issue that you're facing, and, you know, how can we address it together as a team? So it's that also team communication. And then, you know, it's also about building relationships in the firm that you're in. So as I mentioned, you know, here at FTI, we have expertise in so many different things, ESG, you know, tech. And, you know, if you sometimes, you know, come across a problem and you don't know what to do, because you have built that relationship with the different departments, you know, it's just a quick phone call. Can you come in, help me address that issue? So building relationships both within a team, you know, within the firm, and with your client is just so important as a part of the whole project. And then, of course, you know, in terms of these projects, they're all client focused. So keeping that in mind, you know, keeping the client keeping communications open with the client, making sure we say what we do, and meeting those deadlines that we said we would meet, and having that quality of work at the end. That's just so important, because, you know, we want the clients to come back and, you know, use us again. And that's all goes back to, you know, being client centric, and, you know, making sure that, you know, we work with the client, and it's not just we go away for 3 months and come back with something that they didn't expect or didn't know about, that we were doing. So I think those are kind of some of the key qualities. There's a whole bunch, but I think those ones would be my top ones that I would really think about all the time.
I really like the top ones that you've selected, because I feel like the little things, such as being able to build relationships, working with people, knowing those terms in accounting, there's the small things that we learn at university, but some of us might not realize is important. From what you're saying, it's actually very, very important to keep building relationships, to retain those soft and hard skills for the workplace. And thank you for that answer, Joanna.
Oh yeah, it's sometimes you don't realize that you learn it, and then like is actually useful in the long term.
Yeah.
Building relationships, you know, in consulting, it is a lot about eventually you reach a stage where you do have to do business development, and, you know, and building that kind of relationships with different people at an earlier stage just helps you grow as a person, in terms of knowing different people in the industry, different people in also the firm, but also building your knowledge of how to interact with other people. So it is always daunting, but it is a very important skill that, you know, you should just work on slowly as you grow on your career.
Definitely, definitely. And with that comes the next question. So what are some challenges that you have faced when solving client problems?
problems, challenges. These come from so many different angles sometimes. It could be both internally. So let's maybe just start with, we were discussing before, you're working in a team. So, you need to sometimes manage different people, both domestically and internationally. And so making sure everyone's aware of, what is a timeline? What do you require from them? And, making sure that quality of work so that everyone is kind of at the same standard, and the ending quality that you're delivering to the client is almost as if one person wrote it sometimes, rather than different people writing the report. And so that sometimes is a challenge because time zones, different people's English level, and that is something that you always need to, ultimately the client doesn't see that, but it is something that you need to manage in a project. And then, sometimes in terms of the project itself, the challenges you might face is, as I was mentioning, you might get discrete investigations where you don't want to flag, only a very limited number of people know that the investigation is happening. And so you might not get access to everything you want. You can only get access to very limited data that, maybe IT extracted from the back end. And you can only talk to head office, and you can't actually talk to the people who've actually processed the transaction. So you have to, use what you can. And that's where the creative, thinking and problem solving that we were discussing comes in these types of discrete investigations where you just need to investigate what you have, using what you have. And it's not saying it's not impossible. I still can manage to find those kind of red flags and fraud using just financial data, but it helps so much when you have access to the people and the further data of the actual receipts and supporting documents that might be in country or on site in the business itself. But that's the challenging part and fun part of being in consultancy. And I think also, one of the biggest challenges, because we are client facing, is managing clients' expectations, because we want to achieve, we want the client to come back, we want to exceed the client's expectations, but that also involves managing what that expectation is, and pushing back when we need to say, hey, we can't meet that deadline, or hey, your budget, we need to increase the budget because we need further resources on this project, or it's actually a lot more complicated than we initially thought. And in that case, it is having those difficult conversations with the client to let them know the reasons why we need to increase the budget, or we need to increase the deadline. And, because, and that's super important for us, because, we are all, sometimes we're just an independent party that we have to provide an opinion on. Sometimes our reports go to regulators and the court. And so we need to be, robust in the way we approach our investigation, or the findings that we make. And so it sometimes can't be a rushed project. We need to take that time to, do that proper investigation or proper work, detailed work into what we need to do. And so managing clients' expectations is always one of the difficult parts of our consulting world. And then, as we were talking about before, every project is different. And so having that creative solution and coming up with ways to make, to solve the problem is challenging in itself. But, that's what I love about the job. It keeps you on your toes. You never have the same day, as you always say. And, being able to use, I guess, what and the accounting knowledge, but as well as knowledge from different projects and applying it in different scenarios and different situations. That's why I like, and that's why I've been in accounting for this long.
That definitely sounds like very, like, it's a contrast between the fun and the challenging as well, especially within the challenging, needing to meet client expectations, set expectations, build good relationships whilst ensuring that the quality of work is really good. That does sound like a really big challenge.
Like it, but it comes with it. And then as you go on your career and you have a great teamwork, you work with such great people in where, for example, at FTI here, that it actually makes life a little bit easier in that way.
And also, Joanna, earlier in your response, you mentioned about working with people overseas. I'm actually really curious. What advice do you have for people who might be considering taking their consulting career to an international level? for example?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually worked overseas. I've worked a few years in Hong Kong. I would say definitely do it. It is, I do have to say, I didn't like my first 3 months. It is always the initial culture shock. But after the first 3 months, I absolutely loved it. The exposure that you get, the ability to meet different people, and also learn a lot about yourself. About your ability to adapt to different situations, your ability to adapt to a new environment, meet new friends, and also the work that you get is also really different. Sometimes here in Australia, it is a much smaller kind of financial kind of business world. So maybe, in London, in Hong Kong, in China, in Singapore as well, that the money flow, the investigations, the litigation that's in those kind of countries, usually much bigger, a lot more interesting sometimes. And so having that opportunity to work in a different country just gets you exposed to different clients, different industries, different levels of work. And I always say, go do it if you can. And then, people always say they'll stay for 2 years. I ended up staying for 3 or 4 years, a lot longer. And it just adds so much more back, to your career as well as to, you as a person. And then, that's, ultimately it's your career. So I always encourage you to, work wherever. And that's the best thing about consulting, because you can do it in any country around the world.
Yeah. Now when you go to Hong Kong, there's always people there free to have a cup of coffee with you.
Yes, that's true. And, with our global offices as well, we can drop into any of our offices around the world as well. And meet colleagues around the world that say, hey, let's, catch up. And, that's always the great part of, working overseas as well as working in a global corporation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer, Joanna. I'm sure all of our audience were just so fired up at the moment. So keen to see what the future has for us. And once again, we firstly want to thank you for being a part of our Industry Insight Series podcast, where we feature inspirational women in the consulting industry. And from this podcast, we definitely heard great responses, great advice from you and your experience. And moving forward, I hope women in consulting and FTI Consulting can continue to work closely together to bring better events, better podcasts to our audience.